No one could ever imagine that a commercial passenger airplane and a military fighter jet would collide with each other. On one side was Hughes Airwest Flight 706, on the other was a US Marine Corps F-4 Phantom fighter jet at an altitude of 15,150 feet. Both aircraft were on their assigned paths, and both crews believed the situation was under control. Surprisingly, no alarm gave any warning. No radar screen showed any danger. Even air traffic control noticed nothing unusual. Yet despite that, what happened next shocked everyone. The question is, in such a vast sky, where both planes could have been anywhere, how did they end up directly in front of each other? Why did no one see these planes coming into each other's path? And in such a deadly accident, how did one person manage to survive? Let's find out in today's video. On the evening of June 6, 1971, the skies over Southern California were exactly the way pilots like them. Clear weather, smooth air, and visibility good enough to clearly see the sprawling LA basin below. That same evening, Hughes Airwest Flight 706 was scheduled to depart from Los Angeles International Airport. The destination was Seattle, with 5 different stops along the way. It was neither a new nor unusual route, nor any special mission. The crew had flown this route many times before. The aircraft assigned for the flight was a McDonnell Douglas DC-9, a reliable jet considered a symbol of modern aviation in that era. The plane was nearly new, maintenance records were clean, and the airline had a good reputation. There were no technical or operational red flags. In the cockpit were Captain Theodore Nicolay and First Officer Price Bruner, both experienced pilots. In the cabin behind them, all 44 passengers believed this would be a completely normal journey. Around 6 p.m., Flight 706 lined up on the runway and began its takeoff roll with the roar of its engines. The DC-9 lifted off smoothly and turned northeast while climbing. The autopilot was engaged and routine instructions began coming in from air traffic control. At that moment, no one in the cockpit could have imagined that within minutes, this normal climb would take a deadly turn, because in the same sky, just a short distance away, a completely different story was unfolding, a story unseen by the passengers and unnoticed by the commercial aviation system. This story was about a military aircraft that was about to take off. It was a US Marine F-4 Phantom, a heavy fighter jet with the call sign Phantom 458, built to fly fast, climb quickly, and intercept enemies. Its design was completely opposite to that of civilian aircraft. While the DC-9 was built for smooth passenger flights, the Phantom was designed to keep flying even in extreme conditions. But on June 6, 1971, Phantom 458 was not in perfect condition. For the past 2 days, small technical problems had been piling up. First, its transponder had failed, meaning civilian radar systems could not properly identify what type of aircraft it was. Second, its onboard radar was malfunctioning, normally used to detect other aircraft. On top of that, there was a leak in the oxygen system, making high-altitude flight unsafe. In civilian aviation, an aircraft with so many issues would be grounded, but military aviation operates differently. Fighter jets are designed to fly even with damage, at least to return to base. Technically, the Phantom could still fly. The maintenance crew fixed what they could, but full repairs were only possible at the home base. After consulting the duty officer, the decision was made to ferry the jet back to El Toro base under visual flight rules at low altitude. That meant it would not be an instrument flight, there would be no positive radar control, and most of the responsibility would rest on the crew. In the cockpit were two men, pilot James R. Phillips in the front and radar intercept officer Christopher E. Schiess in the rear. Both were young, trained, and disciplined. For them, this wasn't an emergency, just a somewhat difficult ferry flight. But with that decision, the fighter jet had now entered the same airspace where commercial flights were climbing. A shared sky, and a risk that, at the time, no one could clearly see. In 1971, the sky was not as fully controlled as it is today. At that time, airspace was divided into different layers, each with its own rules. At higher altitudes, where commercial jets cruise, air traffic control, ATC, assumed full responsibility. Every movement appeared on radar, ATC separated aircraft, and pilots relied on instruments. This was known as Instrument Flight Rules, or IFR. But hidden within this system was a gap that had gone largely unnoticed. After takeoff and before reaching cruise altitude, commercial planes passed through a zone where control was not completely airtight. In that space, IFR aircraft were climbing, while some others were flying under Visual Flight Rules, VFR. Under VFR, pilots were responsible for seeing and avoiding other aircraft with their own eyes. ATC could assist, but could not guarantee separation. In theory, this sounded perfectly fine. The sky is open, visibility is good, and pilots can visually avoid traffic. But reality was far more complex. Jet aircraft move incredibly fast, so fast that an approaching threat can suddenly become dangerously close within seconds. And at that time, infrastructure was limited, radar coverage was incomplete, and transponders were not considered mandatory. In this very gap, two different planes were slowly moving toward the same path. On one side was Hughes Airwest Flight 706, climbing steadily. On the other side was Phantom 458, flying legally under VFR. Both planes were within the rules, but no system was guaranteeing that they would remain separated. And as Phantom 458 moved forward, its flight was becoming increasingly difficult. Even while flying at a very low altitude of around 1,000 feet, its speed was far greater than that of a civilian aircraft, nearly 420 knots. That meant at an altitude where usually only small planes or helicopters are seen, a heavy fighter jet was racing ahead at hundreds of knots. At such speeds, everything changes quickly. The pilot in the front seat was keeping an eye on both the haze and the surrounding terrain. Southern California's smog can easily deceive anyone. It makes distant objects appear blurry, reduces contrast, and makes depth perception difficult. In such conditions, the pilot had to repeatedly adjust altitude to maintain safe distance from the mountains. Meanwhile, the radar intercept officer in the rear seat was busy with his own tasks. As mentioned earlier, the Phantom's radar was not fully functional, but it was being used in ground mapping mode. That clearly meant the radar was providing no information about what might be approaching from ahead. Technically speaking, if the radar had been in search mode, it might have detected some signal of incoming traffic, even in its faulty condition. But that choice was not made. It wasn't a violation of rules, just a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. Training had taught them to rely on their eyes during visual flight. Radar was considered secondary. But at such high speeds, flying purely by visual reference is not easy. Amid all these challenges, the Phantom adjusted its route toward Palmdale to avoid the busiest part of the LA basin. The idea was logical, to stay away from heavy traffic, but as they moved further ahead, the haze thickened and the terrain below became mountainous and uneven. In such conditions, continuing at low altitude no longer felt safe to the pilot, so they made an immediate decision to climb, seeking clearer visibility and safer separation from the terrain. The engines roared louder, the nose lifted, and the Phantom began gaining altitude. The decision was within regulations, and at that moment, it appeared completely sensible. But that very climb brought the plane into the corridor where commercial jets normally depart and climb. A decision made for safety had now placed both aircraft at the same level. Because on the other side, Hughes Airwest Flight 706 was continuing its routine climb. The DC-9 was climbing steadily, exactly as it was supposed to. There was no panic or confusion in the cockpit. The captain was monitoring the aircraft's performance, while the first officer handled the radio. Shortly afterward, the flight was handed off from Los Angeles Departure Control to Los Angeles Center. This meant the flight had left the immediate airport zone and entered the longer cruise phase of the journey. From above, everything seemed normal, and the climb continued. Meanwhile, Phantom 458 had also reached roughly the same altitude. Both aircraft were now in the same section of sky, but under different rules. The DC-9 was operating under IFR clearance, so it was clearly visible on radar. The controller could see both its altitude and direction. But the Phantom was flying under VFR, and its transponder was not working. That meant even if it appeared on radar, it showed up only as a faint blip, sometimes visible, sometimes disappearing. On top of that, due to high traffic that day, controllers were monitoring multiple aircraft simultaneously. The skies over Southern California were almost always busy. Targets kept appearing and disappearing on the radar screen. Instructions were being issued. Routine operations continued. In that environment, no one clearly noticed that a high-speed military jet with a non-functioning transponder was heading toward the same route. During this time, the DC-9 received a new instruction. It was told to make a slight left turn and proceed direct to Daggett. In a completely calm voice, the first officer read back the message. Left turn 040, direct Daggett. Everything still seemed routine, but no one knew that this would become the final transmission ever heard from Flight 706. Unaware of all this, Phantom 458 had completed its climb and leveled off at approximately 15,500 feet. The pilot kept his eyes fixed on the sky ahead, but a fighter jet cockpit is not designed for perfect visibility in every direction. Space is tight, the canopy glass is thick, and structural frames create blind spots at certain angles. That's why training teaches pilots not to rely solely on looking straight ahead in level flight, but to slightly roll the aircraft to check the sky from different angles. The pilot did exactly that, a controlled aileron roll. For a few seconds, the Phantom inverted and then returned upright. During that brief maneuver, the pilot quickly scanned above, below, and ahead. He saw no sign of danger. The sky appeared completely clear. In the rear cockpit, the radar intercept officer still had his head down, focused on the radar screen. Meanwhile, both aircraft were moving toward each other at a combined speed so high that hundreds of meters were disappearing every second. Suddenly, the radar intercept officer lifted his head, as if sensing something approaching. Where moments earlier there had been only blue sky, he now saw a large white shape emerging directly ahead, the DC-9. But it was so close that there was no time for the brain to process it. The radar intercept officer instantly shouted a warning. At that very moment, the pilot rolled the aircraft sharply, pushed the nose downward, and tried desperately to avoid the collision. But it was too late. At 6:11 p.m. and 20 seconds, the Phantom's right wing sliced through the DC-9's cockpit. Metal tore through metal. Control cables snapped in an instant. The impact was so violent that the DC-9's cockpit and forward section separated within a second. Witnesses on the ground later said it looked as if something had exploded in the sky. For Hughes Airwest Flight 706, everything ended in a single moment. Before we continue, a small request: if you're finding this story interesting, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you more true and astonishing stories. The collision was no minor shock for Phantom 458 either. The fighter jet's nose was completely shattered. The right wing had broken off, the tail structure was torn apart, and the aircraft began rolling uncontrollably. Inside the cockpit, both crew members immediately understood that the aircraft was no longer flyable. The controls were unresponsive, warning lights were flashing, and the situation was worsening with every second. Fighter jets are equipped with ejection systems for moments exactly like this, often the last hope for survival. In the Phantom's cockpit, that decision was made. The radar intercept officer in the rear seat pressed the ejection handle first, but here a hidden technical flaw surfaced, one that had gone largely unnoticed. The Phantom's ejection system depended on an electrical sequence that had a serious weakness. If the rear crew member ejected first, the system's wiring changed in a way that prevented the front pilot's canopy from properly releasing. And that is exactly what happened. The radar intercept officer's seat blasted out of the aircraft. His parachute deployed, and he began descending through the air. But in the front cockpit, the pilot was trapped. His canopy did not release. Without canopy separation, the ejection seat could not fire. This was not some random malfunction. It was a known system vulnerability that was already scheduled for correction. In fact, the following month, several Phantom jets were set to receive upgraded ejection systems. But before those improvements could be implemented, this accident occurred. The pilot had no way out. Within seconds, the out-of-control Phantom crashed into the southern edge of the San Gabriel Mountains. The jet burst into flames upon impact, and the pilot was killed instantly. Nearby, almost at the same time, the remaining sections of the DC-9 struck the mountainside. All 49 passengers and crew members, whose flight had seemed completely normal just minutes earlier, were killed at the scene. In the entire disaster, only one person survived: the radar intercept officer, who had descended safely by parachute. What remained after the accident was not just wreckage, but a mountain of questions. Investigators pieced together the evening's events using air traffic control radar tapes, scattered debris in the mountains, eyewitness accounts from people on the ground, and the testimony of the Phantom's radar intercept officer. The DC-9's cockpit voice recorder was completely destroyed in the fire. The fighter jet had no recorder at all. The final seconds of the story were reconstructed not from cockpit recordings, but from physical evidence and human memory. And when the full picture gradually emerged, one disturbing truth became clear. This was not the result of a single person's mistake. Hughes Airwest Flight 706 was flying according to its clearance. Phantom 458 was also operating within regulations. Air traffic control could only see what the radar displayed. The pilots were trained. Their decisions seemed reasonable at the time. And yet the collision happened. Because several small weaknesses in the system aligned at the same time. The airspace allowed commercial IFR flights and VFR traffic to share the same sky. Transponders were not mandatory for every aircraft. Radar coverage was incomplete. The system relied heavily on see and avoid, even though at jet speeds, the human eye cannot detect danger quickly enough. After this accident, authorities had to acknowledge the flaws in the system. Special VFR charts were created for major cities so that pilots could clearly see the routes used by commercial jets. The airspace structure was revised so that after takeoff, flights would remain under continuous radar control. On the military side, the Phantom's ejection system weakness, which had prevented the pilot from escaping, was officially recognized and later corrected. Training programs were also updated to emphasize how dangerous high-speed VFR flight can be in busy civilian airspace. The tragedy of Hughes Airwest Flight 706 reminds us that in aviation, accidents often develop quietly within the rules, gradually building layer by layer. And by the time they reveal themselves, it is already too late. And if you want to know how a plane suddenly ran out of fuel and crashed onto people having a picnic below, click the I button to watch that video as well.